Hi, everyone. For those of you who are new, thank you for joining. Those of you who are coming back, good to see you again. My name is Michelle Oliver, as Raymond mentioned. I am a principal UX researcher for a company named Ellucian, and we are an ed tech company. So I do a lot of usability research and do both formative, exploratory type of work, evaluative work, qual and quant. But my background is heavy stats and research methods. That's my first love. And when I taught at Texas State, those are the classes that I taught because pretty much no one else wanted to. And those are the classes that I jumped to wanting to teach first. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of our session tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to session 2. If you were not at the first session, please go to the Luma site and check out the recording, because we did record it, as this session will be recorded as well. And it'll be available in a few days. So just keep checking in and we'll get that information to you. Just want to go over a quick agenda items. So what we're going to talk about tonight is we'll start off with an overview of the different types of data. We'll get into basic statistics. So hopefully this will be a refresher for you. If you're just freaking out about it completely, that's okay. I'll just break down step by step what to do and how to do it, and then when and how to use which statistical test for particular scenarios that you may be testing. Okay, and then hopefully you'll have some time for the Q&A. If you do have burning questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will get to them. Also, if you, after the session, you're thinking like, oh, I should have asked this question, feel free to reach out and I'll do my best to answer those questions as soon as I can, okay? Since we do have some new people here, I can't see everyone, but is there anyone, like maybe 2 or 3 people that would like to just break the ice and jump in and introduce themselves? Just tell us your name, what city you're in, and then your role. Anybody interested in doing that?
I can talk.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm Carl. I'm a UX designer for a company that owns a bunch of newspapers, and I live in Denver, Colorado.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Anyone else?
Sure, I can do that. My name is Olivia. I am based in Seattle, Washington, and I'm a senior UX researcher at JLL Technologies, which is a commercial real estate company.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Olivia. Nice meeting you too.
Anyone next?
Thanks.
My name is Alex, and I'm a staff researcher at Salesforce, and I'm currently located in San Mateo, California.
Great. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. No, I don't see any other hands going up. So let's just jump right in. We have a lot of content to cover today. Okay. So let's start off with the different types of data. So like I said, so this session, we're going to be talking like the basics, so basic stats. And then next month, we'll get into more advanced stats. And I'm working on getting a couple of guest speakers for us to get into those methods as well. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing. So let's talk about the different types of data, and having an understanding of the different types of data will help us identify the most appropriate test to use for our research method, okay? All right, so the first category is actually categorical data, which is nominal, right? So anytime you think of nominal data, think of a name. I usually would tell my students nominal name. That helps you remember it. And so you can use any type of labeling for your categories, right? And the categories are different, but there's no meaningful differences between the names or the labels, okay? So for example, if I'm looking at a study that's examining between, PC, Mac, or mobile, I can just categorize them using numbers, but those numbers don't mean anything or carry any weight, okay? Next, we have ordinal, okay? So ordinal, think order, right? So rank or order is going to be important, but those rankings, there's really no difference between those rankings. So an everyday common example would be like, the months of the year, right? So there's a particular order that they follow, but the differences between the months don't really matter. They don't really mean anything. In research, how we think of it is the Likert scale. So you have a scale from 1 to 5. 1 is very difficult. 5 is very easy. So those ranks mean something, but the difference between like very difficult and difficult, it doesn't have any value. Okay. Next, we have interval. Okay, so interval categories and ranks data, it introduces precise and continuous intervals, but it has no true zero, right? The example that we give here typically is like it has, you can have negative values, but a measurement of zero actually represents a quantifiable measure of something. So an example would be temperature, right? So I live in Michigan. It's starting to get really cold. It's about 49 degrees right now. If it went to 0 degrees, which I hope it doesn't anytime soon, if it went to 0 degrees, that doesn't mean it's an absence of temperature, right? So that 0 degrees actually means something, okay? Lastly is ratio. Ratio is exactly the same as interval data. The only thing that's different is that we have a true zero with ratio, okay? So it has a true zero. And so, like I said, knowing the type of data that we have will help us identify the right type of test to use. And the thing about interval and ratio data is because they're so similar with the exception of that true zero, we analyze that data the same way. So we usually call it like interval ratio data, right? Or we assume like it's numerical data. We just lump those two together, okay? All right. So let's do a flow chart. Okay, now you will have all of this information, okay? Because when you look at it, you might think, okay, this is really overwhelming. So I'm going to try to break down step by step. And again, you will have this information, so feel free to reference this if you ever have any questions. So when we start looking at, okay, what type of tests am I going to run? What's out there? Let's talk about the data that we have. First, we'll look at categorical. Okay, so do I have nominal data or do I have ordinal? Let's look at nominal first. Okay, so the question is, well, how many variables do I have? All right, and I can think of this in terms of like the independent variable and the dependent variable, which we'll get into a little bit more when we talk about the numerical data, right? But if I have only one variable, then I'm going to use what's called a chi-square goodness of fit test. What this test does is it tests one variable against a predetermined distribution. So what that really means is that before I even see the data, right, I have a hypothesis of what a distribution would look like. So I might want to compare my data to a normal distribution, right, like that typical bell curve. So I only have one variable and I'm going to measure it against that normal distribution, okay? That's a chi-square goodness of fit test, okay? What if I have 2 or more variables? I'm going to now use a chi-square test of independence. So here what I'm going to be doing, and I want to test to see if there's a relationship between the variables from different sets of the population. So I'm not testing it against a norm or a known distribution. So this is after I get the data, and I'm going to compare them to each other, okay? So the null hypothesis, right? The null is basically that the distributions are similar to each other, right? And what I'm looking for is to see if they're not similar, how dissimilar are they? And is that significant? That's ultimately what I'm trying to find out, okay? So one variable, chi-square goodness of fit, 2 or more, chi-square test of independence, all right? Okay. Let's talk about ordinal data, all right? So the question is, are you investigating relationships between variables, right? Or am I seeing if there are group differences between the groups, all right? And you'll see this question asked again. All right, if I want to just look at relationships between the variables, I'm going to use a Spearman's rank correlation, all right? This is when you have 2 variables, both of them have to be ordinal, okay? Now, sometimes when we have rank data or Likert data, we usually convert it to numerical, like so that we could analyze it numerically. And I will show you an example of what that looks like. But the thing is that you have to weight it a certain way. And that's usually common what we do with Likert scales. But in this case, if you are looking at ordinal data, you have to do a Spearman's rank correlation. I've only seen this like in market research. I don't typically use this in UX. I'm usually weighting my Likert scales because I'm looking for something else. But in market research, they're looking at like ratings of brand loyalty or things like that. They'll use a Spearman's rank correlation. If you've done anything with Spearman's rank correlation, feel free to put that in the chat, and then we can talk about how you use it, okay? All right. If I wanted to look at differences, right? Am I testing differences between independent groups or within my groups or repeated measures? Does anybody have an idea what I mean in terms of the difference between independent groups and repeated measures? Anybody want to say something? Okay, Alex, I see your hand up.
I think I know the difference. Independent groups means that you're comparing, like, let's say group A does a certain measure and then group B does the same measure. And within groups is the same group does this measure and then does a different measure and then there's another measure, multiple ones. So you're comparing against the same group doing multiple things.
You got it. Absolutely. So you're just retesting the same people over and over again, right? Okay. All right. So I know I froze for a minute. I'm sorry. It's starting to get dark and windy here. And anytime it storms, my internet, you just never know what's going to happen. All right. So let me go to my next thing. All right. So if I'm going to do independent groups, what we're going to use is a Mann-Whitney U-test. This compares differences between two independent groups when the dependent variable is either ordinal or continuous. Okay, so it's either rank order or numerical. Okay, so you'll see this test again. But the thing is that it's not normally distributed. So if your distribution is skewed, right, and not normal, then you would use a Mann-Whitney test. Okay, all right. If you're doing repeated measures or within groups test, you will use the Wilcoxon signed rank test. All right, this compares differences between paired or dependent groups or repeated measures groups when the dependent variable is ordinal and again, not normally distributed. Okay, any questions so far? I don't see hands up. Okay, all right. So just showing you all of the tests for ordinal and then all of them for nominal. And this takes care of the categorical types of data. All right. Now let's move on to numerical, okay? So again, interval/ratio data analyzed the same way, all right? And so the question is, are you investigating relationships between variables or differences between groups? Let's say I wanted to look at relationships first. Okay, do you have a true independent variable? Okay, so what does that mean? What do I mean by a true independent variable? Any ideas on that? And feel free to come off mute or. Anyone? Or feel free to.
Is it a variable that isn't impacted by any other factors?
You've got it. So a variable, an independent variable is the variable that you control, right? So you are actually applying the manipulation in some way, and the dependent is dependent on what you did with the independent variable. So you could have two specific groups, and you have like a control group, and then you have a treatment group. That would be your independent variable, right? The dependent variable is like whatever you've measured as a result of that treatment. Okay. I did see a question in the chat. Did we skip the Spearman? No, we didn't. We're going to talk about, do you mean Pearson?
It flashed right before you went to the next slide.
I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you skipped it.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, my chat was like kind of in and out. There we go. All right. So if the question is, do we have a true independent variable? Oh gosh, I went too fast. If the answer is yes, we're going to use a regression. Okay. Now I've seen regression in market research as well. And for using like the Net Promoter Score, the NPS, and it helps us understand the relationship of independent variables to a dependent variable. Sometimes you can do like predictions. You can have like a predictor variable and see its impact on the dependent variable. For the NPS, I saw examples like, okay, what are some of those factors that impact user satisfaction for either, a detractor or a promoter, or, or a passive, response. But I don't see it often used. Has anybody used a regression in your research? And the only reason why I'm asking is that I want to be able to target the right person to show an example of this, perhaps in market research, from market research. Anybody? Olivia, I see you have back in the day.
Yeah, I used to do scientific research and use regressions. I don't have any of the materials on hand though to show.
Okay, well, maybe I'll talk with you offline. Maybe we can like share some, details at our next session, perhaps.
Maybe. Like full honesty, I needed a lot of help to pull it off. Yeah, stats are my weakness.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, like I said, I haven't done it in UX. I did it certainly in grad school. We did like a lot of regression, and it's a lot, and it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of interpretation of the data. So I don't know if that's why it's not as readily used, but like I said, I think in market research, they tend to use it a little bit more frequently, and then they do like more modeling, predictive modeling from that. So I'll try to find some information on that as well, certainly if you all are interested. Okay. All right. Okay. So if I don't have a true independent variable, all right, the question is the distribution normal? Can we assume a linear relationship between the variables? Because that's going to be really important. Okay. If I can't, right, if the relationship is skewed, right, then I would have to be forced to use a Spearman's rank correlation. Okay. Otherwise, I will use what's more common, you probably have heard of in your stats classes, Pearson's correlation. All right. The thing about the Pearson's correlation is that you have to have linear relationships. Okay. That's a given. If you don't, then you have to use Spearman's rank. Okay. That's going to be the big difference between those two. All right. Any questions? Okay. I see in the chat, t-test requires that you categorize the data, I think. Marja, can you talk a little bit more about that? Yes, you do, but I want to make sure that I understand where you're going.
Sorry about that. I was responding to the comment earlier about why use a regression instead of a t-test.
Oh, okay.
Regression allows for continuous variables, and with a t-test, I think you have to like split the data into categories, right?
Yes, with the t-test, you have to either categorize, and depending on what statistical package you use, you either have to categorize them by numbers or by groups, and you have to be very specific as to which, participant is in which group.
Yeah.
And you have to actually label that.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just responding to that earlier comment, not to what you were currently saying.
Gotcha. I'm a little bit late on the chat, so.
No worries.
All righty. Okay. All right. So now that's all of the relationships. Okay. So that's that branch. Now we're going to look at differences. All right. And this is where I used to live. This is like the stats person dream is looking at differences between groups, right? So how many groups are we comparing? Okay, let's say I have one group and I want to compare it to a norm, a normalized distribution or data that currently exists in the population. All right. Do I know the population standard deviation? I'm going to tell you, most cases you don't. All right. Especially if you're doing data, just like research, the type of research that we're doing, we likely don't know it unless you're comparing it to a norm. Let's say, for example, like standardized test scores or something like that. Right. But if you happen to know the population standard deviation, you would use a z-test. Again, z-tests are pretty rare because you're likely not going to know the population standard deviation, especially in usability testing, okay? Because we're typically sampling from the population, okay? All right. Next is no. Let's say I don't know it, then I'm going to use a one sample t-test, okay? One sample t-test. It does a correction for that standard deviation so that you can use it if you have one sample, all right? Let's say I have only two variables, right? And I want to see if there are group differences, which will likely be the case in most of our situations and scenarios. The question that we want to ask is, can we assume that the variances are equal? Okay, Michelle, what does that mean? Right? How I look at it is that if I'm looking at the two groups, are they for the most part similar, right? In statistics, you probably heard that, okay, it's really dependent on sampling and you have to sample from the population, random sampling, and then random distribution into groups. We typically don't do that in usability. It's pretty much like, okay, these are the participants that I have. I'm going to separate them into groups. I'm not really thinking about randomizing them as I'm doing that, right? In practice. But if you can assume that most of the groups are similar in most of their characteristics, with the exception of the independent variable that you're introducing, that's what we mean by, are the groups similar? Can we assume equal variances? In most cases, so depending again on the statistical package that you use, I don't know what you all have access to. What I'm going to show you today is going to be Excel. But if you have more advanced stat packages like SPSS, you can do a test, and they call it a test for homogeneity, right? And it's just testing this. And SPSS will do some corrections for you if those variances are not equal, okay? So that's a good check to have if you have access to it. Otherwise, it's okay. But if you can assume equal variances, right? And the answer is yes, you would do an independent samples t-test if your sample is independent, right? If you are assessing the same group, like a pre-test, post-test, then you would do a repeated measures. For me to break it out on this flow chart would have been a really big mess. So I was trying to keep it as simple as possible, okay? So independent samples t-test, because you have two groups, right? Either those two groups are separate, or you're taking one group and you're doing like a time one and then a time two, okay? All right. If it's no, then you're going to use the Mann-Whitney or Wilcoxon rank sum test. Looks familiar, right? We were doing this with the categorical side, but the Mann-Whitney test is going to be for independent groups, okay? And the Wilcoxon rank sum test is going to be for within groups, right? So repeated measures, all right? Okay. Let's say you have more than two groups, right? And it's certainly possible, right? Let's say you wanted to look at Mac, PC, mobile. It's certainly possible that you'll have more than two groups. Again, we want to ask that same question. Can we assume that the variances between the groups are equal, right? Yes. If yes is the case, you'll do an analysis of variance or ANOVA, okay? And all of this can be done in SPSS, you know, certainly we could do this in Excel as well. If not, then you will use a Kruskal-Wallis test, which I have not used. So just full disclosure, I have not used this in the field. Certainly exposed to it in graduate school, but I haven't used it since I've been in UX research. Okay. All right. I see some questions here. What's the advantage to using t-tests versus ANOVA? Okay, so the thing about, I'm more partial to ANOVA. Oh, Stephanie, I see you said ANOVA is my favorite. Yes, I'm more partial to ANOVA as well. There are a few reasons. When you get the output for an ANOVA, it gives you a little bit more information, and then it'll tell you a little bit more about effect sizes. And without getting too much into it, we can certainly get into it in the next, our next month's session. If you'd like, certainly let me know. All right, because I'm about to like fan out over here. But the thing about ANOVA in the output, it'll give you effect sizes. So rather than just saying, yeah, it's significant, there's a significant difference between groups, it tells you how significant that significance is. And that's what's important with ANOVA. And some people really want to know that. sometimes our stakeholders really want to know that. The t-test, you have to calculate it if you're going to do it. So I'd rather just do it all in one shot, and that gives me all the information that I need. And I can do all of these like homogeneity tests and everything and get everything that I need in one shot. The other thing, I think somebody else asked this about, can you use ANOVA for just two differences? Absolutely. The ANOVA and the t-test are very similar, and I think that the ANOVA is more versatile because you can use it with two variables. The thing about the t-test, why you can't use a t-test for more than two, is that it only looks at two at a time. So you would have to do group 1 and 2, then group 2 and 3, and then group 1 and 3. And each time you do that, you introduce the possibility of error, right? Because again, we want to make sure that we set our p-value at 0.05. If you're doing that test 3 times, it's at 0.15. Okay, so if I had a choice, I would likely do the ANOVA test over the t-test, even for 2 groups. Okay, the thing is, you have to know your audience. So my stakeholders now, if they see an ANOVA, they don't want to talk to me about it. They don't want to know because they see the degrees of freedom. They're like, why is there 2 degrees of freedom? And then I say, oh, well, there's a degrees of freedom between and then within. They're like, nope, I don't want to hear that. So I tend to do, depending on who it is, I'll tend to say, okay, I'm going to do a t-test because it's only 2 groups anyway. It's not that serious. This is what they want to know. And then they get it. Now, if I'm reporting to, my manager, my senior manager, we will go all out and do all of the stats because like, I know that he's going to appreciate that and he understands the whole effect size. So yes, I will put effect sizes on the agenda for next time. Okay. Thank you for that. All right. Okay. All right, so this is everything for numerical. And I know it looks a little bit overwhelming, but I think that when you like just try to break it down, like what do I have? Then it'll help narrow down the types of tests. And I know it doesn't help that you can use more than one for different scenarios, but hopefully the scenarios that I do break down for you, just in my research practice, might help you, identify which tests to use in your practice, okay? All right, so let's see some stats in action. Just keep in mind that you'll want to be sure that you have a clear understanding of what your teams and you would like to know, right? Also understand what your variables are so that you can identify the most appropriate test for your study, okay? So last week we talked a little bit about the different types of tests, just in general, like, hey, usability tests, and then we have, survey testing, we have A/B tests. So we'll see how much we can get through tonight with some, examples with data. All right. Okay. So let's look at usability testing first. So I know with usability testing, we usually will do quant and qual. I usually will now do quant and qual, right? So I'm testing, looking at tasks. And then I want to also know like why. I want to know the behaviors behind it. So I'm just going to focus on the quant side of it, but know that when I'm showing this as an example of a usability test, I did also ask a lot of probing types of questions. Okay, so we'll just make that assumption that that's what I'm doing here as well. In this case, I wanted to have users create a new communication plan. This is at a higher ed institution, and we had an existing product that needed a major, major overhaul. And we were trying to figure out, okay, we have some prototypes, let's test it and get it in front of users and see which is going to be easier for them and quicker for them to complete, right? So the first thing that they had to do was, go to the see their active plans, create a communication plan. And a pop-up comes up and we have this stepper, pattern. So users know where they are because the existing solution did not have that. And then they create, the plan, set up, they identify who the recipients are going to be. And then they have like the actual activities where they had to click in certain nodes and split it apart. So if the people on their recipient list was part of one department, they got one communication message and another got a different communication message. So it was a little bit tricky, but people that create communication plans understood the task, they understood what to do, right? And then they saved it and then their communication plan was updated and created, okay? So we tested that with some users, and this is the raw data that we have, right? I had 31 people in each group. I actually did have more, but there were a few that either abandoned or they didn't complete. So we had 31 in each group, and I was looking at as much data as I could possibly get. So time on task, unique page views, number of clicks, whether they, were successful or not. And then I had a lot of different, additional questions, and I had them like indicate like their level of satisfaction, all of that additional data. Tonight, I'm just going to show you how I analyze the time to complete. Again, I tend to collect more than what's asked, because I feel like if I have a warm body there, then I want to get as much information, because I get them back. Especially like because I'm dealing with clients and not necessarily the general population, and we don't pay our clients, so they may not come back. Okay, so this is all assuming that we're using Excel, okay? The majority of tests, that the common tests that you'll run, you can run in Excel, okay? Other more extensive tests will require more advanced software, but in general, like I said, I'm usually using Excel, okay? So go to Excel, you select data from the menu, okay? You go to data analysis, all right? And then once you click data analysis, you can identify from a list, and you can see this little scroll here, that there are a number of tests options that are given, which I really appreciate. So I select 2 sample equal variances. If I selected unequal variances, so let's say my sample size in one group I had 86 people, and the other group I had 25, then I'm like, well, there's a really big difference between groups. It's likely that there's going to be some unequal variances. I would definitely choose unequal, but if they're really close, I will choose equal, because if you run it both ways, you're still going to get very similar results, okay? So just wanted to point that out. And then I don't know how comfortable you are with using Excel, but it really is pretty straightforward. Once you've done it once, it's like, oh, okay, I pretty much get this. But this pop-up will come up, and then you'll see this little, it looks like a little mini spreadsheet. You click on that, it'll take you to your spreadsheet, and then you can highlight the ranges that you need. So you select the range for your first variable, and you'll see it right in there, right? That's my range for my first variable. I was looking at time to complete. And then once I select the range, I just click that back, and it takes me back up here, okay? All right, I'll do the same thing for the second variable, okay? And then I always want to make sure that I select labels, because if you don't, you just get the output and you may not know what it is. Okay, so I usually will select labels. So the output will tell me, this is my critical value, this is the actual value I received. It just makes it a little bit easier to read. Set alpha to 0.05. I do believe it's defaulted in Excel, but just in case, make sure you do that double check. And then I just click on my spreadsheet to select the output, like where do I want it, right? If I don't, it'll just put it in another window, but I usually try to keep everything in one space. That's just a preference, okay? And then write up your findings. So I'll show you how we write up our findings. So there's a significant difference in the time to complete between the existing workflow and the proposed workflow. All right, how do you know that, Michelle? Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the actual value, right? And when we typically report in stats, we have to actually report the statistic. So this is the T statistic. I'm telling my reader, my audience, I did a T test. This is the degrees of freedom, okay? And then the actual value, 7.47, I just rounded, right, to the 100th place. And then I give the p-value, whether it's less than 0.05. If it's really less than 0.05, I'll put it as 0.01 if it's less than 0.01, okay? So where I get the value from, you see that there's a 1 tail and then there's a 2 tail. Does anybody know the difference between the two and why we would use either? Okay, I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Let me go to these really quickly while you think about the question I posed to you. I'm curious about sample size for a quant usability test. I recently read this article from Nielsen Norm Group, which suggests 40, but I couldn't clearly follow the logic. Okay, I'm afraid to open the link only because it might mess up my my deck. Sarah, would you mind talking a little bit more about what the article says? I'll certainly check it afterwards and we can discuss more, but I don't want to like deviate from here and then I may not be able to get back.
I don't want to like take you away from you know the webinar that you've
No,
mapped
you're
out.
fine. This is why we're here. I want you to
Um,
ask questions and we have conversations.
But essentially, Nielsen Norman group suggests that only 40 is necessary for and the sample size of a quant usability test. And I just really couldn't follow their logic. Let's see, I'm trying to they had a bunch of assumptions behind it. You want to estimate a binary metric such as success rate or conversion rate. So that might be the issue, and aim for a 15% margin of error.
I see. Okay, so I'm going to tell you my personal opinion, okay? All right. So I don't think that there's really a hard and fast rule. When I was in school, they said 30. 30 was the magic number, right? As long as you had at least 30 in each group, you're fine. And then it was 40, and then it was 30 again. And then it was like, well, you know, if you're around 30, like 28, you'll be okay. I don't think that there's really been consensus reached about that, to be honest with you. The idea is that when you get to the number 30, right, as you approach 30, your distribution starts to look more normal. And that's like the rationale behind it, is that your goal is to get as close to a normal distribution, and 30 seemed to be the magic number that got us there. Now, I don't know the validity of that. I've read a few articles about it, and there've been a lot of arguments about that as well as effect size. I think that there's just no consensus on it.
Okay.
I think it just really depends. When I do usability studies, I just try to get as many as possible. That I'm just going to be honest with you. And sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. So I will put in my analysis and my write-up, like, okay, I only had 22. So this is not, the difference between 22 and 30 is still not representative of the population either way, right? So, you know, I still make that disclaimer. But if I'm talking about like 100, you know, I had to say like 220, you know, people, I won't put that disclaimer. And I'm like, well, they're pretty much representative of the sample as best as I can make it. So I think the hard and fast rule, yeah, some will argue 30, some will argue 40. And I know I didn't really answer that, but I don't think you could go wrong with 30.
Yeah, you did a great job. I heard similar about the distribution when I was in grad school, about, you know, 30 being a minimum number for a sample. So yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, another question, is 0.05 standard in UX? Can we use a larger p-value? Typically 0.05 is the standard, because what it's saying is that I want to allow myself 5% error, right? So 5% chance of making an error. So if there is a group difference and I say, yep, this is actually a better, you know, a better prototype than the existing, but you know, I'm really giving myself like a 5% chance that it's not, right? So I'm 95% sure that this is the better outcome, and that's typically the standard. There are some fields that go a little bit stricter. I'm trying to remember, I think the highest I've seen it has been 0.1, like a 10%, and that might be in like educational research. They're a little bit less conservative, and like medical research is even more conservative, it's 0.01. Right, so, but it, you know, the standard is 0.05. All right. Let's see. Kayla asks, can you talk about when time on task is most appropriate in usability tests versus when it may not be appropriate? Yes. So it really depends on what your team wants to know. So when we have complaints from our clients that says, this is just too complicated. I cannot, it takes me so long to get through this communication plan, or, whatever the task is. And then we come up with, okay, well, we have a new product, or we're trying to iterate on this and make this a better experience. Time on task, that's been the major thing. It's taking too much time. That's going to be a very important metric, to help with business outcomes. If it's not necessarily a time issue, and it may not be a time issue, if I'm seeing that the time on task is similar between groups, but there are a host of other problems, meaning like they don't complete the task correctly, then time on task may not be as important to me. So it really is dependent on what the ask is from my stakeholder. And then I can help, frame like, okay, well, what have been some of the issues in the past? Maybe I've tested it out and it's just, it's really complicated, or maybe it's something is not being conveyed to the user well enough. So it may not be a time issue. And then you also have to weigh, okay, I want to see how a user does this without any interruption whatsoever. So I don't want them to think aloud, right? I just want them to do the task, because time on task may be important to my team. Otherwise, if I'm really trying to understand their thought processes behind it, and I'm not really concerned about how long it takes them to do it, I might just say, well, just think aloud. I want you to take as much time as you need to tell me everything that you need to tell me. That might be more insightful for my team. The other thing is also with like number of clicks. I'm also a little bit hesitant about counting the number of clicks, because some users will take many clicks to do the thing that they need to do, and they'll still report it as being really easy and a really good experience. So number of clicks is another one of those that I have to say, okay, well, if they've done it in a time that's okay for them, right? Like, is that really a bad thing? Or if they've made several clicks to get there, is that really a bad thing? If they accomplished the task and they were satisfied with how they got there. Let's see. Kayla, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Would you use the one-tail test? Thank you. Okay, that's what I was going to get to, the one-tail test. Okay, let me ask it first. Let me ask your question, Raja, and then let me make sure I get it. Would you use the one-tail test if you're predicting the difference to be in one direction? Yes, absolutely. And I'll give you an example. Versus hypothesizing a difference without specifying. Yes. In which case would you use the two-tail test is less powerful? Let me get back to that, because I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. So in this case, we had an existing product, and I'm going to be honest, we knew it was terrible. We knew it was a bad experience for our users. And we were going in with the assumption that whatever we do, like this prototype is going to be a better experience. I don't want to test a prototype that I know is going to be bad. So I'm assuming that this is going to be a good experience for my users. A good experience means less time, right? Less number of clicks, better reported satisfaction, those types of things. So that's directional, okay? So I'm saying that that's going to be a one-tail test, right? Because I'm making the assumption that this is going to be a better experience than the existing. If I had two prototypes, let's say I have a net new product, and we're thinking we can go this route or we can go this route. I have no idea which one is better. I'm going to do a two-tail test, okay? So that's the difference, and you'll want to make sure that you know which one you're testing as you're going in. Okay, I hope that answered the question. Okay, so in this case, this was a one-tail test. So this is my T statistic, and I'm getting back into a little bit of the stats. So I'm looking at the one-tail. This is the critical value, right? So the critical value is basically like you're going to compare your value to this critical value. This critical value is 1.67. My value is 7.46. So that's way past that critical value, right? If I had a whiteboard, I would show you a standard distribution and plot it out and show you where everything is. But this is just telling me like, okay, I know that 7 is far from 1. how big is that difference? How far is that? And I'm going to look at this p-value. All right. And I see I have an exponent in there. So this is way less than 0.05. So I know that it's significant. Okay. So that's what I'm going to be reading is this p-value for the one-tail test. If this is less than 0.05, which it is, then I know that it is significant. Okay. All right. So this is where I get my values from. And then I'm also going to include, again, this is a stakeholder thing that, I know that they like. They want to know, well, okay, significant, what does that mean, right? So users that had the proposed workflow, they took significantly less time to complete their tasks than those who use the existing product. And then I include the means and the standard deviations because they like seeing that, and that's important to them, okay? Mean is right from your output. You see that there's variance. All you have to do is take the square root of the variance and you get your standard deviation, okay? So just a really simple calculation, all right? All right. Okay, let's talk surveys. So last time we met, I had made reference to jobs to be done framework, and a couple of people were like, yes, please say something about jobs to be done. So I'm going to do this, and then I'll do like a typical, survey response. Okay. So jobs to be done is a framework that we use at our company when we have no existing data on a topic. Right. So we had no formative data. We had no data existing anywhere about a product that was related to cross-registration. So think of like if you are at a home institution, you want to take classes at a guest institution. What are some of the pain points and some of the issues? We didn't have any data on that. We have assumptions. We had no data. All right. So there's this jobs to be done framework by Tony Owick. I will get a link to you so you can, check out his book. But basically how we started off is we did the formative work. We conducted a whole bunch of interviews and identified the needs that students had regarding registering, right? And then created these needs statements from that data, and then we put it into a survey to validate those needs. And in the survey, we asked, okay, how important is it for you to, number one, increase the likelihood that advisors will have information that you need about cross-registration? How satisfied are you with your current solution in doing the same thing, right? So it's product agnostic, right? So this was not like any of our products, like I said, we had nothing. I see, Alex, you did jobs to be done at Salesforce. Okay, so you're very familiar with this process. Okay, so yes, Tony Owick's opportunity score. Awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna start to show like what we did, how to calculate the numbers and stuff. So the first thing, conducted the interviews, right? Validated the needs by way of a survey and looked at importance and satisfaction. And then what we did was we created frequency counts for each of those responses. So how many people reported? Not at all. How many people reported? Somewhat, right? Important, very important, extremely important for both importance and satisfaction, okay? So we do this for the importance metric as well as the satisfaction metric. All right, come on, in advance, okay. And then you create the importance and satisfaction proportions. So how we do this, we just add the number of 4s and 5s to get the proportions, right? Which is a simple calculation in Excel, just add them up, right? And create a new column. All right. Next, divide the proportion by 10, right? This is part of the procedure as outlined in the jobs to be done, the theory to practice by Tony Owick. And then you calculate the satisfaction gap score. Okay, the gap score is, all you have to do is subtract the satisfaction score from the importance score and you get the gap score. Okay, so 3.3 from 4.0, you get 0.7. Okay, all right, then you calculate the opportunity score. So the opportunity score is the importance score plus that gap score. Okay, so you subtract numbers first, and then you add that subtraction back to the importance score, okay? And then we rank order the opportunity scores. So, excuse me, I usually rank them from largest to smallest, right? And basically what high opportunity scores mean is that users thought that it was very important to them, whatever that line item was or that need was, and that they were currently very unsatisfied with their current solution. All right. The next steps I usually do, and it depends again, this depends on the stakeholder, is I will do a scatter plot. I'll take the importance and satisfaction, put it on a scatter plot and see where the points lie. And OWIC has this, and I'll show it to you next time. I know like we're already like running out of time. We should have done this like an hour and a half, but he has this, like you draw diagonals in it. And if scores fall beyond one of the diagonals, then that's an unmet need. If they fall between the diagonals, that means that the need is being met in the market. And then if it's to the left of the leftmost diagonal, it means that it's overserved in the market. All right, so you can really see from the visual, like, oh, this area is underserved. That's what we're gonna innovate on. And that's how we use it at our company. In most cases, just using the rank of the opportunity scores, my stakeholders to say, okay, great. I can see where, some of these are compiled together, or we'll just take those top 10. And we know if we take those top 10, it's going to cover a lot of those needs. It really just depends, but it's a really cool deliverable for them because they get to see exactly what the needs are and how our solutions can meet those needs. Okay. All right. So you may ask, what about correlations? Didn't you say something about Likert scale and correlations? And hopefully I can get through this in the next 5 minutes. So let's go for it. Okay. So we sometimes do these pricing surveys to see what customers expect to pay for future products, right? So we have like, what type of institution are you? Are you willing to buy a new product? And if it came out, what pricing would be too cheap? What would you say is like, no, that's cheap. Like, I don't know, there might be something even wrong with it. It's too cheap, right? What is fair pricing? What is premium? And then what would be like, there's no way I'm going to purchase this, it's just too much, right? The thing about correlations, the good thing that I like about them is that you can throw them all into the analysis, right? Just be mindful that the output that you get only looks at pairs at a time. Right. So you don't have to do separate correlations for each pair that you're interested in. Just throw it all in there. And then, you can analyze it, look at the analysis when you get it out. We call that correlations. The range is from -1 to +1. All right. So if you get a number that's outside of that range, then something went wrong somewhere. Values that are closest to 1 in either direction, whether positive or negative, tells us that it's a strong correlation and perhaps significant. Okay, you could do some calculations additionally to find out if it's significant or not. But in most cases, it's just a matter of, okay, how strong is this correlation? Positive values are when both variables are related in the same direction. So think like higher temperatures yield higher ice cream consumption. All right, that's a positive correlation. All right. The inverse is that like you have a positive and a negative. Okay, so that's an inverse direction. So negative mean, the negative correlation means that they're in the opposite direction. So like a higher cost will lead to lower sales. Okay, all right. So let's see if I can do this really quickly. Okay, so in your Excel file, you will select data, right? And then data analysis, similar to how we did before. This time you're going to scroll towards the top and select correlation, right? We're going to do something very similar to how we did, the t-test. You select the input range, right, from your spreadsheet, and then you select an output range. Okay, so the input range, you can put all of your variables in there, and then the output range is just asking you where on the spreadsheet do you want your output. Very similar to the t-test. Okay, come on, mouse. Doesn't like me today. And select OK, right? And then write up your results. Correlation is very, very simple in Excel. Okay, so I usually will write there's a moderate positive relationship between FTE and the cheapest subscription option, okay? And I have my R, that's Pearson's R statistic, my degrees of freedom is n minus 2, because I have 2 variables, right? And it's equal to 0.44. This is going to be my value in the from the matrix, right? And then P is less than 0.05. It doesn't give me, this doesn't give me the P statistic. If I did this in SPSS, it would, okay? But Excel doesn't give me that, all right? But I can look at this chart to see, okay, this is, moderate association. It's likely going to be significant. If I to square the actual R value, that will tell me like the effect. It tells me like the amount of variance that's explained by that relationship. Most of my stakeholders don't care about that. They just want to know, like, well, where is the correlation? What's going on here? I may go on to explain a little bit more about like participants with a higher FTE reported higher values of entry subscription options that they're willing to pay compared to those with a lower FTE. Okay, and that's pretty much straightforward. We have 1 minute. So I don't have time to go into A/B testing, but just as a teaser, we're going to talk about the chi-square test next time. It has a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated because it's not really complicated, but more detailed calculations, but all of it can be done in Excel. And I will certainly take some of the questions that you had, suggestions, effect sizes. We talk a little bit more about that at our next session.